All right, so now we've basically finished our treatment of biological anthropology and we're going to move into archaeology. You all should have taken exam one prior to opening this lecture. If you haven't, go back and really, get that first exam out of the way so that we can really shift our focus and not carry over too many things. There are some things in this lecture that do specifically also apply to biological anthropology, particularly as we talk about dating techniques and excavation, right? That, of course, can be very important in a paleoanthropological context as well. So know that there is a little bit of carryover, but those things are related to really any time that we're trying to learn something about the past, whether that's a past through material remains and artifacts, or whether that's a past through fossils. So we will specifically address how biological anthropologists and archaeologists study the past. We will also discuss how dates are obtained, how anthropologists are able to determine the dates of sites, remains, evolutionary events, and then we'll talk about some of these unique ethical concerns and issues that affect both biological anthropology and archaeology. So, archaeology really focuses on human behavior and social patterns. Specifically, we are looking at material remains and analyzing those material remains. When you really think about it, basically, we're doing work with garbage, right? Because those material remains are often things that have been discarded or left behind, whether they were left behind by a population dying out or whether they were left behind by populations relocating, right? So, we're essentially digging in the dirt for really old stuff, and then analyzing that and inferring what we can about the behaviors and social patterns of the populations that provided those remains. So, biological anthropologists, of course, can study both living and recent humans and primates, as well as the deceased and ancient ones. Archaeology is really focused on older societies, whether they are prehistorical, that is, before the advent of writing, or whether they are historical. Now, there are some uh, kind of new age anthropologists. I don't mean new age like a spirituality movement. I just mean new, like up and coming anthropologists who are doing some interesting work with contemporary populations, working in garbage dumps and such. Also looking at like kind of an online archaeological presence, like what's left over after we've engaged in kind of the reputation that we want to build for ourselves online, kind of that digital footprint. But by and large, we're talking about past societies. So, paleoanthropology, of course, looks at skeletal material and related material remains. And so there's not a really good clear cut boundary, let's say, or way to identify that here is where biological anthropology ends and where archaeology begins. Studies of sites often end up being multidisciplinary, can include paleontology, looking at ancient life through the fossil record, right? How do we determine when something is uh, you strictly a study of human patterns, or when we've got other animals such as those that humans use for food that are being analyzed as well. It can also involve palynology, which is the study of ancient plants through pollen samples. So we're able to see what plants were present in the ecosystem as well as what plants were of particular use to these human populations. And there is this field called bioarchaeology, which kind of bridges the gap between paleoanthropology and archaeology, where we're studying human skeletons to reconstruct physical traits, health status, and diet. And so bioarchaeology really is kind of bridging this gap between what has traditionally been paleoanthropology and conventional archaeology. So anything that we're able to recover from a site is useful for analysis. We can use visible remains like the floor plan of structures, like roads that still keep a mark on the surface and from aerial photography. We can also utilize microscopic evidence like phytoliths. These are plant crystals that we often find remnants of in teeth and as well as in storage vessels. We can look at things like starch grains. We can look at fossilized pollen to determine maybe um, how domesticated plants came to be or how the plants that people have used historically for a long time as part of their diets, how those have changed in more recent times. Because of this, that multidisciplinary nature doesn't simply extend to kind of this time frame and kind of crossover, but not only do we have a crossover between those people who would work with like the living species that were present in a community, we've also got some crossover with like climate studies, mapping, like GIS systems, etc. Okay, so anthropologists, archaeologists will make wide use of any kind of evidence that can help them to establish both where to place sites, where to find sites, as well as how much to excavate and preserve. So anthropologists will use satellite imagery to find ancient footpaths, roads, canals, irrigation systems. We use this technique of remote sensing to be able to locate where we might expect to find sites. Right? I mean, it's really hard to know before you find evidence at a site. It's really hard to know where to begin digging, and it's actually there's something called the archaeological paradox. That basically the only way that you can study a site is to excavate it. However, once you excavate a site, you basically destroy it. And through digging things out of the dirt, right? You expose new surfaces to erosion and such. You expose sites to plundering. You really destroy any what we consider in situ evidence or that which is still embedded, like in the dirt. As we excavate artifacts out of the dirt, right, we're destroying any kind of context that dirt may have provided. So, there's always that important question of do we excavate and how far do we excavate, right? We've got to recognize that as we change technology, as we innovate new ways to maybe image that which is still buried, right, through like ultrasound and stuff, that in the future, there may be better techniques that allow us to study sites without having to destroy sites. All right, so an example of this use of remote sensing, there were images from a NASA satellite that were used to locate buried footpaths that link a cemetery to a spring and quarries in Costa Rica. Right, so sometimes it's looking through these aerial photographs. Sometimes archaeology is done because there's going to be development done on land. And generally, when you want to do something like build a new Walmart, break ground on a new housing development, etc., you've got to have some sort of both ecological survey as well as an archaeological survey. So you've got to make sure that site is not sacred or of any particular cultural significance um, to people of the area, whether that includes living populations or whether that includes um, kind of populations that have since departed. Archaeologists and biological anthropologists also share interests in the techniques that enable them to reconstruct human pasts. So this will be obviously done through the use of material remains, but also through fossils that are left, right? Now, when we get to that window of when is something considered skeletal material and when is something considered fossils? Well, I mean, for things to fossilize, the living skeletal material is transformed into minerals, right? That's really what distinguishes a fossil from like skeletal remains. So sometimes we're looking at actual remains. It could be bones, it could be fossils. We might look at traces, like footprints that are present in the dirt, traces or impressions of ancient life forms. When we find a site, and so sometimes these sites are brought to the attention of anthropologists because of people who just happen upon something. So one one thing that I feel like I need to preface this discussion of is that you are not allowed to do any kind of collecting, whether it's of material remains or fossils on any public lands. Okay, so if you're out hiking in the Sandias, if you're out hiking in the open space like the foothills or out by the volcanoes or anything like that, and you find something like pottery shards or jewelry or arrowheads, you are required by law to leave that at the site. Okay. You're not allowed to dig it up and take it home with you. Now, private land, um, technically that those objects belong to whoever owns the land. But when we're talking specifically about things like Native American remains in the New World, right? There are federal laws like NAGPRA and such that prohibit removing even some material remains from private sites. Um, by and large, if you find human remains, if you find funerary rites, if you find anything that has to do with dead bodies, you want to leave it be, report it to the authorities so authorities can come and do with it what they need to, whether it's relocate those remains, whether it's to um, follow protocol with local representatives of the ancestors of those remains, etc. Don't ever disturb human remains if you find those anytime that you're out and about. So don't just go out like collecting things on your own. Okay, things need to be left in situ to be able to place the context and meaning of those things. And so if you just dig it up and then you go to like the Forest Service office or something and say, "Hey, I found these pottery shards. Are they important?" Right? You've removed a lot of what they're able to infer from those remains, from those material remains. You've removed that kind of measure of context. So it becomes increasingly impossible to uh, be able to determine whether there was any kind of cultural significance. So you find something, leave it there, right? What is the Forest Service statement? Something along the lines of leave only footprints, take only memories, something like that, right? Definitely photograph what you find, but um, don't take it, right? Don't collect it because you don't know the significance of those particular remains to people in the area, right? All right, so once sites are identified, then you have to go through this intense process of surveying, and then and only then will you perhaps excavate, right? Excavation is not always the decision that's made. All right, so that brings up these techniques, systematic site survey and excavation, right? A systematic survey is the gathering of information on settlement patterns or the distribution of sites within an area. And so we can often determine like roads or footpaths that were used quite widely from these aerial photographs. But then we've got to translate what we can see from the air into actual work done on the ground. So this systematic surveying allows us to figure out the locations of specific features within this overall settlement site, right? And then surveying may be followed by excavation. With excavation, you dig through layers of deposits that make up an archaeological or fossil site. These layers or strata help help archaeologists to establish a relative chronology or timeline for the material that's covered or that's recovered. So we're basically trying to determine who, what, when, where, how, right? And that excavation process, we're gaining as much information from other other characteristics of the site than we are simply from what we dig out of the ground and take away from it, right? So what it's buried with, what it's buried near, etc., all of those things really matter in our interpretation of material remains. So sites are mapped and surface data is collected so that archaeologists can decide where to dig. The collection units allow researchers to record the exact location of an artifact, fossil, or feature. So we're going to look in just a second at a picture basically that shows the kind of how is archaeology done. And then we can also we also have to sift through any of the dirt or sediment that's recovered from the site to make sure that we're getting really small things out as well. I mean, the best case scenario is to find something whole and complete that's embedded in situ, right? Where we can work really carefully to dig out the entirety of that object. That's while that's the ideal, that's not really what happens very often, and instead we're often digging up things that are broken or somehow in pieces, and we often don't find the entirety of an artifact, right? We just find some broken shards of it. So knowing the context is really, really important. That's why we don't just start digging something up as soon as we find it. Okay, so flotation is a technique that's used to recover small remains, things like fish bones, carbonized plant remains, etc. That's where you take the sediment and you run it through water, basically, and things that are lighter than dirt minerals float to the top. That allows us to determine what other small kinds of things might be present. All right, so here's a picture that shows this process of kind of mapping out and systematically setting up a site. You see the how every part of that site is set up into like these blocks, right? So that we're mapping that site pretty clearly. So um, this is a grid that's put into place, and this happens to be at Teotihuacan in Mexico, and that grid enables researchers to record exact locations of things. Okay. Once you've removed things from the sediment, you've removed sediment as well. This is a sieve. This shows you how you might sift through sediment to determine what kind of useful bits and what material remains are present and separating them out from the sediment that they were buried in. This kind of sieve could also be coupled with that technique of flotation where you run running water through the sediment to determine if there are any kind of smaller things that you're missing that would otherwise be small enough to pass through the openings of that sieve.